Hi everyone, welcome to our live biology group tutorial this afternoon. As always, just going to wait a few minutes for everyone else to join. And while they're joining, just to say, if you're new and this is your first session, welcome to the My Tutor Online School. We are really excited to have our very first biology session today, which I know if you're not new, lots of you have been requesting for more of the sciences. So today we've had a full day of sciences. We've had physics and biology. And this is our first biology one, so really excited to get things going with all of you, and thanks for coming back if this is one of your many tutorials with us. So today's biology session is on lungs and gas exchange, and it is going to be led by one of our amazing biology tutors, Charlotte. Just a little bit of information about Charlotte. Charlotte actually has done over 150 lessons with my tutor. She also studied conservation and biodiversity at Exeter University. And as I said, she'll be leading the session today. If you are new, just to say that all of these sessions are recorded, and the best way to get access to them is to sign up to the My Tutor Online School, so you can make sure that you're being notified on where you can access all the resources that we have for you guys. Cool, so I'm going to hand over to Charlotte, who will do the session today.
Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Charlotte and I'm very lucky I'm taking this first biology tutorial as part of the My Tutor Online School. So we've kind of picked lungs and gas exchange today because it's a topic that's covered by all specifications. We've kind of targeted this towards the AQA specification, but it's also applicable across others. Hopefully it's something that you might have studied before. If not, it's an opportunity to learn something new. And what we're going to do is we're going to run through lungs and gas exchange. So what happens when we breathe in, what then happens in our lungs, and then what happens when we breathe out. And then we're going to compare that to how gas exchange works in the gills of a fish. And then hopefully we'll have time to go through a past paper question and answer some of your questions as well. So that's the plan today. I thought we'd start in the lesson space here with a diagram of our respiratory system as a whole. So here we have our nasal cavity and also our mouth. So when we breathe in, the air travels down through our trachea here and into our lungs. And our lungs are made up of the lung, the bronchus, which is the main kind of air passageway in the lung. They then split into bronchioles, which are smaller passageways again, and then they split in turn into alveoli, which are these tiny sacs where gas exchange takes place by diffusion in the lungs. So that's our respiratory system as a whole. We also have on the outside our diaphragm, which sits under our ribs themselves, and the intercostal muscles, which are in between our ribs, and the lung cavity, which is called the pleural cavity. Okay, so we're going to do this with kind of alongside our breathing. So I wanted to start with what happens when we breathe in. Okay, so I've taken a lot of these diagrams from BBC Bitesize, which is a fantastic set of resources to use when you're revising. They've got really good diagrams and I highly recommend them. So when we breathe in, this is called ventilation. So we breathe in air, and air is made up of many different elements, but mainly oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. So we breathe those in, and it's about 21% oxygen, and that's the bit that we are looking for when we breathe in. So when we breathe in, we can do it now. If we take a deep breath, our diaphragm contracts and pulls downwards. Our intercostal muscles contract as well. So at the moment, everything is contracting. And this makes our ribs move upwards and outwards. So it increases the volume of our thorax, the pressure decreases, and air is drawn into our lungs. So this is the beginning of ventilation. This is what keeps the concentration of oxygen in our lungs quite high. We can continually breathe in this high volume of air. Okay, make a new slide. What happens when the air gets to our lungs? So this is the next stage. We've breathed the air in, it's gone down our trachea, as we saw in that first diagram, and then it's proceeded into our lungs, so down the bronchus, the bronchioli, and to the alveoli. Let's pop this diagram in here. Okay. So, within the alveoli, this is where gas exchange takes place properly. And when we talk about gas exchange, we talk about the movement of oxygen, O2, into the blood, and the movement of carbon dioxide, CO2, out of the blood. And this happens by diffusion. Gas exchange takes place in the alveoli by diffusion. Okay, now we want this to be as efficient as we possibly can. And if you've ever talked about diffusion before in your lessons, you'll know that there's 3 ways that we can increase the speed of diffusion. And those 3 ways are: 1, increasing surface area; 2, shortening the diffusion pathway; and then 3, maintaining a high concentration gradient. Now, the alveoli in our lungs are adapted to enable us to do those 3 things within our lungs. So the alveoli are really great at making diffusion really fast and really efficient, to make sure that we can take the oxygen out of the air into our blood and the carbon dioxide out of our blood and back out into the air through breathing out. Why do we do this? This is really important for respiration. So once the oxygen has left the air in our lungs, gone into the blood, it's transported around our body and taken to our muscle cells where respiration takes place. And this is what gives us the energy to move and to function. So gas exchange in the lungs is a really important part of that. Okay, so how do the alveoli in the lungs increase surface area? So, alveoli are very small. And there are lots of them. There are about 700 million alveoli in our lungs. Let's move this text box so that it's a bit clearer for everyone.
Hi, Charlotte. We've just had a question come in to ask what maintaining a high concentration gradient means.
Okay, no problem. We can cover that in a second when we talk about it, if that's okay. I think it will make more sense when we cover it in the context of the alveoli themselves.
Sure.
If that's okay.
Yeah,
okay.
sure.
So let's keep talking about surface area at the moment. So we've got lots of very small alveoli, and the alveoli themselves, let's say about 70% of the surface of our alveoli are covered by tiny blood vessels called capillaries. So the size of the alveoli and the number of the alveoli and how much of their surface is covered by capillaries all contribute to there being a huge surface area for diffusion to take place across. Okay. So that's that first point there. So the second way that alveoli help to increase the rate of diffusion in the lungs is by keeping a short diffusion pathway. So walls of both alveoli and capillaries, those blood vessels that we talked about, are only one cell thick. There is only a short distance for gases to travel across between our lungs and blood. And thirdly, we have this high concentration gradient we were talking about, and you wanted to know more about what a high concentration gradient is. So when we talk about diffusion, we're talking about the movement of gases from an area of high concentration. So at the moment, our lungs, where there's lots of oxygen. So high concentration means that there's lots of particles of oxygen. And then we talk about the movement of those particles to an area of low concentration. And the difference between that area of high concentration and the area of low concentration is the concentration gradient. So, maintaining a high concentration gradient. Our breathing that we talked about on the slide before, where we talked about how we breathe in a large volume of air, and we do that continually, that helps to maintain that high concentration of oxygen particles within our lungs themselves. Concentration of oxygen within our lungs. Not so good at speed typing. So this works alongside our blood flow, which continually removes oxygenated blood from around the alveoli and replaces it with deoxygenated blood. So this means that the blood flowing past the alveoli is constantly low in its concentration of oxygen, because as soon as the gas transfer takes place by diffusion, that blood is taken away to the rest of the body where it's used. Let's just move this down slightly so that you can see all of that. So I hope that answers that question of what a concentration gradient is and why it's important to keep it high. If we go back to looking at our diagram of alveoli, we can talk about all of those things. So you can see here that the shape of the alveoli, you can see that a lot of it comes into contact with this blood vessel. So that provides that high surface area for diffusion to take place on. And then we also see here this very thin wall of the alveoli, which joins to the very thin wall of the capillary. So that provides the shortened distance for diffusion to take place. And then we can also see here this deoxygenated blood. So the oxygen in that blood has been used up around the body, and then the blood's been brought back full of carbon dioxide, which is the waste product of our respiration process. So that CO2 can then diffuse back into the lung, while that oxygen that we've just breathed in can go back into the blood to be transported again. So it's this never-ending cycle. So to complete the journey of our breath, we've just seen that the carbon dioxide, that waste product, has diffused back into our alveoli. So we've had our oxygen going out and the carbon dioxide going into the alveoli. That carbon dioxide is a waste product. We need to get rid of it. And there's a very convenient way of doing that. We do that by breathing out. When we breathe out. Well, breathing out is pretty much the opposite of breathing in. When we breathe out, if we do that now, so take a deep breath in and then breathe out, there's a big decrease in volume in our chest. So our diaphragm relaxes and moves up. Our intercostal muscles, they relax as well. And generally everything moves inwards. So the volume of the thorax decreases our chest. That means that the pressure within there increases and it forces the air out of our lungs, up our trachea, out of our mouths and our noses, taking that carbon dioxide waste product away and also leaving that ability for us to then breathe in and breathe in a lot more oxygen so that we can then keep on fueling that concentration gradient so that our oxygen can diffuse into our blood. Okay, so that's what happens in humans. But how does this compare to fish? So this is another part of the specification. You need to be able to compare human system to fish. So how does this compare to fish? Well, fish don't have lungs, so they don't have alveoli, but what they do have instead are gills. So let's have a quick look at gills themselves. So here is a fish, and fish have a kind of flap behind their eyes called the operculum. And water flows over the gills and then out through the operculum. So when a fish breathes in, it breathes in water, not air. The water moves over the gills, where gas exchange takes place, and leaves through the operculum. So if we then look inside a gill, we can see so gills have lots and lots of little filaments in them, called filaments. They also have a network of capillaries that work through these filaments and connect to this oxygenated blood, deoxygenated blood here. If we have a look within one of those filaments, going to move down a little bit more. So we can see within those filaments now, you've got this capillary network that join back to that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood that we saw before. So fish also use those three methods of diffusion, but in a slightly different way. So let's number them again. So 1, surface area, lots of gill filaments to increase surface area in a similar way to our alveoli. So fish have lots of gill filaments. Number 2, we talked about a short diffusion pathway. So here again, the walls of the filaments and the capillaries are 1 cell thick. And number 3, maintain a high concentration gradient. So here we can see that blood in the capillaries is transported in the opposite direction to the flow of water across the filaments. This is called a countercurrent flow and maintains that concentration gradient. So it keeps the blood flowing in the opposite way to the water, so that you've always got water that's full of oxygen coming into contact with blood that doesn't have much oxygen in it at all. Now, fish are quite extraordinary. Let's move up a little bit more so we can get a look at those gills again. And that they have to work much harder than us to get the same amount of oxygen out of water as we do from air. Because in general, water doesn't contain as much oxygen. So that means that the efficiency of gills in fish is actually much higher than our lungs for maintaining that diffusion of oxygen. So fish are actually definitely more efficient, and you could argue better at extracting oxygen from water than we are at extracting oxygen from air, purely because there's less available to them, so they have to work much harder. So that's a really important point to remember. Okay, so now I think we could run through part of a past paper question. Were there any more questions that came in, Frederica, that it would be worth us having a look at before we do that, or is it best to wait?
I had one question come in asking, would they need to compare to any other animals, or would it just be fish?
Just fish in the AQA syllabus. And then also, and perhaps something for another tutorial, looking at gas exchange systems in plants as well. So it's comparing two parts of a plant and how they do their gas exchange, and then also lungs and fish are the two that are suggested by AQA. I'm not sure whether that differs for other syllabus. I don't think so, but I'd have to double check.
Cool, sounds good. And then one of the persons asked if you can scroll back down quite very quickly. I think they might just want to make a note of the content at the bottom of this page.
Oh, yes, of course.
And apart from that, I think we can maybe carry on.
Okay. All right. Well, let's have a couple of minutes, or a minute, say, of just looking at this content, having a think about what you've learned, making sure that you've made all the notes that you want to make if you're making notes, and then we'll move on into a past question. I will get that ready now.
I've also had people asking if if this recording will be available to watch back. Yes, it will be available to watch back. So don't worry if you haven't managed to make a note of everything that has appeared on the screen. There will be a recording for this session as well.
Okay, thanks, Frederica. We'll just move on to the next slide and we'll pop up a past paper question. Okay, so I'm going to try and make this a bit bigger so that you can all see. They don't always transfer across properly, but I think you should be able to see the top there. So we're going to talk about some exam technique as well as the question itself and answering the question itself. This is a really common question that comes up. So there's definitely some keywords that you can use here that we've just talked about. So it's using exactly what we've just spoken about. So the first thing to do when you look at a question, before you even read the question itself, is to make sure that you read the describing text, have a look at the diagrams and underline anything that might be important. So we take a pen and red colour. So we can see here that we already know from the description that we have lots of alveoli in our lungs, and that this diagram shows some alveoli, and we know that it's a human lung. So we don't need to worry about the fish at the moment, we can just concentrate on the human lung. We can see the bronchiole here within the lung, moving into the alveoli themselves at the end, and they've also labelled these blood vessels that are covering the alveoli. We also have a scale bar here, 0.1 millimeters, so we know that we're working at a very small scale here. And then we can move on to the question itself. So it says, give 3 features of the alveoli that allow large amounts of oxygen to enter the blood. Okay, final thing to do before we plan our answer is to double check how many marks this question is. And this question is worth 3 marks here. 3 marks means 3 points. So we need to give 3 features and each one of those would give a point. Okay, so what did we talk about earlier in the tutorial when we mentioned 3 ways that we increase diffusion in the lung? And diffusion is how we get large amounts of oxygen to enter the blood in the lung. So that is exactly what you need to quote for this question. So the first thing that we mentioned was that large surface area. And we need to make sure that we relate that to the alveoli themselves. Make the writing on here a little bit smaller. So 3 features of the alveoli that allow large amounts of oxygen to enter the blood. The first feature of alveoli is their large surface area, isn't it? So alveoli are small and there are lots of them in the lung. So there is a large surface area for transfer of oxygen to take place by diffusion. That's our point 1. Okay, point 2. What was the next thing we talked about? We talked about a short diffusion distance, didn't we? So how do we relate that to the alveoli? Well, the walls of alveoli are very thin, only 1 cell thick. So there is a short diffusion pathway for oxygen travel over. That's point 2. And finally, our third point, making that a bit more difficult. We'll move it up in a minute. So our third point was about concentration gradient, wasn't it? So what is it about the alveoli that contributes to that high concentration gradient that allows diffusion to be really fast and really efficient? Let's write alveoli are surrounded by capillaries, carry away oxygenated blood. Ventilation also supplies a lot of oxygen to the lungs, so there is always a high concentration gradient for oxygen to travel down during diffusion. Oh, let's correct that bit. Okay. Just move this so that you can see it properly. It's just taken off the little bit at the end. There we are. You should now be able to see pretty much all of those. So that's how we would answer part A of that question. 3 points, 3 marks, all structured around how to make diffusion faster and relating that to alveoli in the lungs. Okay, so let's move on to part B. Okay, this one's easy. So, B part 1, name the process by which oxygen passes from the air into the blood. Well, we've been talking about that quite a lot, so I hope that you know the answer to that. The answer is diffusion. Make sure for this part of the question that you're still underlining it. So we want a name. We know it's 1 mark, it's probably 1 word. We want the name of a process. And also make sure that you don't get it confused with other types of movement of particles. So you could also, when you think about gas exchange or any sort of movement, you could think about diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. Diffusion is our passive way of particles moving. It doesn't take any energy, and anything to do with us breathing is always a passive response, so it's definitely diffusion in this case. It's not osmosis because it's not to do with water. And it's not active transport because it doesn't require any ATP. Active transport requires energy for it to take place, whereas diffusion doesn't. Okay, let's underline the key parts of B part 2 there. So breathing allows large amounts of oxygen to enter the blood. We've just heard that in part A, haven't we? Large amounts of oxygen entering the blood. But here they're talking about breathing. Explain how breathing does this. Okay. the automatic reaction here, for me as well as you, is to think, I'm pretty sure I've already written that in part A. We know how breathing helps, it aids diffusion in the lungs. But this question is asking for something a little bit different. So here, when we talk about breathing, we're talking about the act of breathing itself and what we were talking about earlier with ventilation. So here we need to think about how the act of breathing itself allows large amounts of oxygen to enter the blood. So when we talked about breathing earlier, we said we take a deep breath, our diaphragm contracts and moves down, our intercostal muscles also contract and move our ribs out and up so that we get that big cavity within us that allows lots of air to come through our mouth and our nose, down our trachea, into our lungs. And there's one part of the 3 ways of increasing the rate of diffusion we talked about earlier that this helps with, and that is maintaining that concentration gradient. So if we didn't breathe, we would have some oxygen in our lungs. That oxygen would diffuse across into our blood and be taken away. And then we'd also take some CO2 out of the blood that followed, and then everything would stop. There's no movement of air in or out, so there's nothing maintaining that concentration gradient to make that process of diffusion take place. So this question is asking for that little nuance. So let's say this is a 2-mark question. We forgot to have a quick look at that. It's a 2-mark question, and it has a command word that says explain. So it is asking you to explain a process. They want a little bit of a longer answer here. This is more than 1 sentence. Ideally, it's 2 sentences for 2 marks. So we would say that, let's put the diaphragm and lungs allow us to take in a large volume of oxygen by ventilation, keeping the oxygen levels in the lungs high. This maintains the concentration gradient between the air and blood so that large amounts of oxygen diffuse rapidly into the blood. I'll rearrange this so that you can see it better. In fact, let's pop it underneath. Okay, so that is that question. Just going to pull up the chat box and have a quick look through while you're finishing making your notes. Okay. So, can you please explain what happens to our alveoli when smoking? Okay, just having a look through some of the questions. So we've got one here, where are the gill cells that we spoke about? Okay, so let's move back to our fish slide. So I perhaps could have made this a bit clearer. Let's zoom out on this slide a little bit. So each of these diagrams on this page takes a closer look at what it looks like inside a fish. So in this first diagram, let's move in a little bit and look at that first diagram. You can see the position of the gills on a fish. So they're just behind the eye. They're kind of where our ears are now. And when you look at a fish, it's quite easy to think of where the gills are as an ear. So the water goes in through the mouth. Let's get my pointer up. In through the mouth here, travels across the gills here, and then out of this flap here. Keeps moving along the fish. Ooh. Now, if we zoom in to this circular area here, so that's what the gills look like from the outside. You can see them on a fish. If you've ever come up close to a fish and have a look inside, it's difficult to do without hurting the fish, but if you've ever had fish for dinner, for example, you can have a look inside that flap behind their eye and you can see the gills in there. So within the gill itself, each gill is made up of these filaments. These look kind of hairy. And then within each filament, so the next diagram is zooming in to part of the filament here. You have this countercurrent flow system of blood vessels. So I hope that answers that one. Okay, let's move back to that last slide. Is there diffusion when anaerobic respiration happens because there's no CO2? The answer is, so anaerobic respiration takes place when we're working really hard. So respiration takes place normally. So I think of it as, so say I'm running, if I'm jogging, I mean, I can go along and I don't have to work that hard, quite hard, but not that hard. If I then sprint, I'm starting to work really hard. I'm breathing faster. I'm trying to get as much oxygen into my lungs as I can to get that oxygen into the blood, to get it to my muscle cells, to allow respiration to take place, to keep me moving. Sometimes breathing just can't do that fast enough. And then we move into this anaerobic respiration. So where we start breaking down some of the products that we already have in our muscle cells, so some of the fats, and we start to use that rather than the oxygen that's brought by the blood to respire. That obviously has a slightly different process, and therefore I see what you mean because there's not so much CO2 being produced, but the answer is that it's very rare for there to be only anaerobic respiration taking place. And it certainly doesn't happen for very long, and there'll always be other parts of your body that will use that oxygen that you're breathing in. Because when you're sprinting really hard and you start to use anaerobic respiration, it's not, you don't stop breathing. So the oxygen that you're breathing in will always be used somewhere. So the answer is that as long as you're breathing, there is diffusion taking place in your lungs. I hope that answers that. I hope that's okay. And the last one I have here is, can you please explain what happens to our alveoli when smoking? That's a really good question. So when smoking, our smoking involves inhaling a lot of different substances. And within those substances, there are molecules that are very similar to tar, or they are tar. And that gets taken into our lungs, straight down our trachea and into our lungs. And over time, those particles accumulate, and they accumulate in the alveoli, and slowly they start to form like a sticky layer along the bottoms of the alveoli. And when that happens, it's very different, or it's very difficult for gas exchange to take place. So you're very slowly covering all of that great big surface area that your body has got for diffusion to take place, and covering that in that tar-like substance. And so diffusion eventually can't take place very well, or certainly in only some places where that tar hasn't reached. So you'll quite often find that if you're a smoker, or if you know people that smoke, then they find exercise a little bit more difficult because there's just less oxygen diffusing into the blood and getting to the muscles to fuel that exercise. So they tend to become short of breath a little bit quicker, and not be able to run as far usually. So it depends on people themselves, and it's different for everyone. So you'll find some people that have been smoking all of their lives and don't see that much change, but it always has an effect in some way. Okay, so I think there's some more.
I've seen one, Charlotte, which is, in GCSE, can we answer in bullet points, or will we have to write in full sentences?
Ooh, good question. The answer is kind of both. So the best thing is to write in full sentences, but if it helps you to bullet point those sentences, so we have kind of introduced the idea here that each sentence should be a mark. If it helps you to bullet point those sentences, then sometimes that can be a good thing, particularly for longer questions, and examiners shouldn't penalise you for that. But equally, you don't want your bullet points to be in note form. They should still be in full sentences so that the exact meaning of what you're talking about is displayed. Okay, I hope that answers that one.
Yeah, I've seen another one, which is, for the previous question, part A, do we have to write that much for just 3 marks?
Okay, you're right, it is quite a lot, and looking at the space that you're given, you perhaps could do it in less. I've structured those answers so that they're very clear for revision purposes, but they could be slightly shorter, couldn't they? So the first one that talks about the large surface alveoli of the large surface area of alveoli could be shortened and just say that there's lots of alveoli and they have a large surface area. So that would be a feature of the alveoli. But I would still say that you ought to write in full sentences where you can, because sometimes I find when students don't write in full sentences, some of the meaning is lost. So it's always best to make it really easy for the examiner. They've had to mark goodness knows how many papers by the time they get to yours. Make it really easy for them to give you the marks. Okay.
And then the last question that I've seen come through is, do you have a simpler question just to help with understanding?
Okay. I can have a look, as in a simpler past exam question. Let me, let me check whether any of the ones that I have would make it a bit easier.
While Charlotte's looking for that question, I'm just going to answer some other general questions that have come through. I've had a question asking if there are any new subjects this week, and I'm assuming that that's in regard to new subjects for biology. So the full week of biology tuition on the online school will be starting from Monday. So look out for information on when those sessions will be. I've also seen another question around if we could do a lesson on transcription and translation within DNA. So once we start having the regular biology sessions, there'll be hopefully a variety of topics that we will get round to covering. And had another question through around, will there be other English and maths tuition for the rest of the week? So there will be maths tuition for the rest of the week, as well as physics. And if you were in the English session today, then you would have heard me say that there'll be English sessions, more English sessions coming next week. I think that's everything from me. I've also seen a question, Charlotte, come through, which is, do you have any revision techniques that would be useful to learn new topics? So if you have time, maybe after we answer this question, then maybe we can pick that one up.
Okay, yep, no problem. I have found a question. Oh, it should appear any second. Here we are. There we go. Okay, so here's kind of a fairly simple start to a question using a diagram and name the part of the alveoli there. So if we do the same technique that we did before, diagram shows an alveolus. An alveolus is the singular form of alveoli, so this is just one, and a blood vessel in the lung. Draw a ring around the correct answer to complete each sentence. So these are nice questions. 1 markers. Blood vessel X is an artery, a capillary, or a vein. Let's scroll up a little bit so that we can get an idea of blood vessel X. So here we have the alveoli itself, alveolus. We can see some cells here. These are the cell wall of the alveolus. And then we have this blood vessel here that surrounds the alveolus. Each of these circular objects is a red blood cell. And then we can see the cells in the wall of that blood vessel as well. Now, what was the name of the smallest type of blood vessel that we talked about that surrounds those alveoli? That is a capillary. And then the second part of the question, gases pass across the wall of the alveolus by which process? Oh, we have a choice of diffusion, evaporation, or fermentation. Interesting choices. The one that we've talked about today and the one that applies to gas exchange in the lungs for 1 mark is diffusion. Make sure when you're doing even simple questions like this that you do read them properly. Gases pass across the wall of the alveolus. Occasionally you get caught out by them suggesting something different. And equally here, blood vessel X, you may occasionally have a question where they've got blood vessels X, Y, and Z. Make sure that you're talking about the right one. These are marks that you don't want to throw away. So there is a second part to this question, which is, I'll transfer that across now. This is quite a nice one. Talks a bit more about breathing and ventilation itself. Oh, so here we have a table. Can you see that okay? Yeah. So let's underline the keywords again, as we did before. So the table compares the concentrations of some gases in inhaled air and exhaled air. So we talked about inhaling at the beginning of a breath and then exhaling at the end of a breath. It says complete the table. Write lower or higher in each box. One line has been completed for you as an example. It's 2 marks. So here I would say that's probably 1 mark per line. So how do we fill this in? So we're looking at here, for that middle line, carbon dioxide concentration in inhaled air and exhaled air. So carbon dioxide is our waste product of respiration. So carbon dioxide travels from our cells where respiration is taking place, goes into the blood, goes into the lungs, and then is taken away from the lungs. So it's exhaled. So there is more carbon dioxide in exhaled air. So we would put higher here. Let's lower the size of that text to match there. Then we just need to decrease the size of that box. So higher there. And therefore in inhaled air it would be lower. Let's pop that one there. In turn, our oxygen in inhaled air, oxygen is used in respiration. So when we breathe in air, it goes into our lungs and the oxygen is taken out. When we exhale, that oxygen has been taken out, so there will be lower oxygen when we exhale. So in inhaled air, it will be higher. Make that nice and small. Just alter the size of that box so that we can write next door. Oh, lower in exhaled air for oxygen. Okay, nice 2 marks in that question there. Okay, any more questions? I'll just bring up.
So I think, Charlotte, because we just have 2 minutes left, there's some questions that I can probably answer, and then we can maybe call it a day. So I had a question asking how much these sessions cost. All of our sessions on the online school are free. So if you've signed up to the online school, then you'll be able to access all of these sessions. I've also had a question asking if chemistry is coming. Yes, we do have plans for chemistry. So look out for information on a chemistry session coming this Friday, which is very exciting. And then hopefully next week we should have all of the sessions that we've had this week on full schedules for next week. So as I say, the best way to be updated and know what's coming is to sign up to the online school, and then you'll be able to know how to access all the sessions and also when to expect them all. Is it true that you only get 15 free lessons? As I said, all of the lessons on the online school are free. So make sure you've signed up and you can access them through that. That's everything from me, and I think the hour is up now. So thank you, Charlotte, for running the session, and look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow for all the sessions that we have going on there. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.